Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much, Russell and Kings, for hosting us tonight. I hope you've all voted. You've got until 10 o'clock, so if you get out of here, you could still rush home and do it. Apologies for holding this lecture on election day, but of course, we weren't to know. But I am very pleased, of course, that we are holding the elections. So I'm delighted to welcome you to this lecture by Simon Wren-Lewis. My name is Patrick Allen. I'm the chair of the Progressive Economy Forum, and this lecture is the fifth in a series that we have organised over the last 9 months. The lecture is entitled The Lies We Were Told, and we also have contributions from our distinguished panel, Anne Pettifor, Maya Goodfellow, and Erin Davis. 550 people signed up for this event, an evening lecture on economics. I think that is an amazing achievement, a record turnout for us. And it's a huge tribute to Simon and the impact of his blog, Media Macro, the impact it's had on the world of politics and economics. If Simon were to set up a fan club, I would be the first to join. I started reading his blog in the days after 2010 when austerity started to bite. Simon was angry about the introduction of austerity and cuts to public spending, which were delaying recovery from recession, and the nonsensical justification which was given. He was annoyed at how parts of the media supported the false narrative that Labour caused the global financial crisis of 2008, or was responsible for the resulting debt and deficit, that public spending in a recession was wrong, that the nation's budget must be balanced like the household budget. So Simon's reaction was to write the blog, and he's been at it ever since. It is an amazing body of work, a minimum of 2 blogs a week. As Simon says, even first-year economics students knew that austerity in a recession when interest rates are at rock bottom is self-defeating. But constant repetition has made the public believe that austerity was necessary. Simon saw that politicians were using austerity as cover for the real agenda to shrink the state. Last time I checked, Simon had counted the cost of unnecessary austerity at £10,000 per UK household. Now, if anyone can change minds by argument, Simon should be able to. But is he, as Krugman says, like Cassandra? The gods have given him the power of true prophecy, but he's cursed so that no one will believe him. I hope not. I find him convincing. And I added Simon to my must-read list, along with anything by Paul Krugman and Harjun Chang. Here was the right level of expertise, analysis and passion. Now, I wanted to help the next progressive government to adopt policies to end austerity. Something had to be done to dismiss the myths, which have probably cost Labour the 2015 election. So this turned into a plan and the foundation of the Progressive Economy Forum last year. We have to do something now to reverse austerity and the profound effects of cuts to public spending. Our country and our society is literally falling apart. We have food banks in every major town and city. They didn't exist 10 years ago. Children are going hungry to school. Child poverty is going through the roof. The welfare system of William Beveridge, which led the world, is being dismembered. I can do no better than to quote from the United Nations report published this week by Professor Philip Alston, which stated that the UK safety net has been deliberately removed and replaced with a harsh and uncaring ethos. That levels of poverty are not just a disgrace, but a social calamity and an economic disaster. He reports that 14 million people in the UK are living in poverty, with 1.5 million classed as destitute and unable to afford basic essentials. Blaming immigration for the effects of austerity has been disastrous and has led to the Brexit vote. The right kind of economics is the solution to create prosperity, eliminate poverty, and grotesque inequality. And this is the programme of the Progressive Economy Forum. We are drafting credible and sustainable policies to replace austerity. We wish to stop austerity and to stop it happening again. We're reaching out to politicians who are likely to form the next progressive government to help them draft and adopt credible and sustainable policies. We want to transform economic debate and the understanding of economics by education and training for policymakers, MPs, civil servants, and the media. To do this, we've created a council of leading economists and academics and a secretariat. Many of the council are here tonight, I'm delighted to see. We have created the space for debate on innovative policy ideas like basic income. We're planning an MA in progressive economics. Our council meets monthly. Lectures like this by council members deliver the ideas. Papers and blogs have been written and published. We have worked with John McDonnell and his team on issues such as the National Investment Bank, the Keynesian multiplier, and Bank of England policy. And that has just been the first year. So, important to say, we remain politically independent. Now, to introduce Simon, his academic background is impeccable and extensive. He's worked in government and academia, lastly as a professor at Oxford University. He remains a fellow of Merton College. He devised the fiscal credibility rule, which John McDonnell has adopted. His blog is read by policymakers all over the world. It has rave reviews. His weekly analysis of Brexit permutations is a wonder, but it can make your head hurt, mine certainly. His book is a collection of the blogs with his commentary. Now, Simon will now tell you, I think, about 3 particular lies that stand out, lies told by politicians and abetted by the right-wing media, lies which have had a real and very lasting effect. So, over to you, Simon.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I particularly want to thank PEF and Patrick for organising the event. I want to tell a story today about an ideology called neoliberalism and how that ideology overreached itself with devastating consequences for the country. It's the main story in my book. This overreach involved actually 4 big lies. Lies that would have a profound effect on people and how they were governed. The lies were told by politicians, but the UK media played a critical role in either promoting these lies or not challenging them, such they became to be believed by a majority of voters. My story starts in the first term of the Labour government. Labour mainly represented neoliberal stasis. It accepted the major reforms of Thatcherism, but it didn't try and move the agenda forward, neither did it in a major way try and roll the agenda back. But it could also be described as neoliberalism with a human face. Serious and successful attempts were made to reduce poverty and also increase the budget of the National Health Service. The first big lie was about immigration. After the election of a Labour government in 1997, one of the Conservatives' attack lines focused on immigration. William Hague talked about a foreign land, and he meant the UK becoming a foreign land. The popular narrative is that concern about immigration just reflects rising numbers entering the UK. And perhaps that's true to some extent, but I want to suggest it is certainly not the whole story. So I don't have many charts. This is the first one and probably the most complicated one. The squiggly line there, the squiggly blue line, is voter concern about immigration as recorded in opinion polls in the standard way. And you can see that really picks up about the year 2000. And that actually picks up grey line numbers in a big way net migration in 1997. So it's a 3-year gap, which is rather long, really, as a lag, slightly implausible. But the black line is the number of stories in the press about immigration. And you can see that it's much closer to the increase in voter concern. Now, if press coverage was just factual, informing people about the numbers and the pros and cons and in a sort of balanced way, then really there'll be nothing more to say. But it wasn't factual. Instead, coverage was designed to raise concern or even indeed fear. This is just headlines some of them, a small sample, from the Daily Express. You can see exactly the same thing in the Mirror and the Sun. I put the Express up there because it's just had a new editor. And he said when he saw these headlines, he actually had a sleepless night, and he's told his journalists no more scare stories about immigration, which is, at least some progress. But the coverage was designed to increase concern. It contained sort of terms like mass and flood and things like that. The evidence that immigration concern was actually created by the media as much or more than the numbers is actually much stronger than the headlines and the coincidence of lines on the previous chart. Concern about immigration tends to be highest in areas that there's no immigration or very little. And indeed, when people are asked about it, they say, well, it's not actually a local problem, but it's a problem for the country as a whole. And the best predictor of concern about immigration, it's not even political party that people support, it's the newspapers that they read. So my argument is that, in part, concern about immigration is generated by right-wing politicians and the right-wing press. I think too many on the left assume this concern is all xenophobia or worse. And I'm sure there is some of that there. But particularly after 2010, it became more than that. Another line pushed repeatedly by politicians on the right and the right-wing press is that immigration reduced real wages and reduced access to public services. This is probably one of my favourite polls. It was taken around the time of the Brexit vote. And it basically says, do you think immigration is good or bad? The green line is good, the red line is bad. And if you look at things like, does it affect you personally, the area in which you lived, it's either sort of neck and neck, or actually on British economy, much more people think it's good than bad. But the area where bad is way ahead of good, the one area, is the NHS. Now this is incredible because not only do immigrants provide the doctors and nurses in the NHS, but in terms of money, immigration provides a net input into the public purse because immigrants pay more in taxes than they take out of public services because they tend to be young and healthy. So it's actually opposite is true. And the only way I can account for this kind of poll finding is that the constant repetition by politicians and the press that immigrants were responsible for pressure on the public services, people started to believe it. The second, and in a way, an additional piece of evidence is, we're getting ahead of ourselves if we're talking about Brexit, so I'll come back to that. But one point about Brexit, or subsequently to Brexit vote, is that you've started to hear lots of stories in the press about the negative consequences of EU immigrants leaving. So increased vacancies for doctors and nurses, etc., etc. And I don't think it's coincidence. Concern about immigration has fallen quite substantially since the Brexit vote. And you might think, well, that's because EU immigration has fallen. But actually, non-EU immigration has increased. So I don't think it's got anything to do with the numbers. I suspect it's because immigration has had much more favourable coverage because of the stories about vacancies and that kind of thing. Okay, that's my first big lie, immigration. The second big lie, which Patrick talked about, was the idea that in the middle of a recession, When you can't cut interest rates any further, you should start worrying about government debt. Max out credit cards and all that nonsense. What we know as austerity. Now, pretty well every first-year student around the world knows that what you do in a recession is that you use monetary and fiscal policy to stimulate the economy. The exact opposite of austerity. What is more, the state-of-the-art macro says exactly the same thing. So it's not surprising that when 50 leading US macroeconomists were surveyed in 2012 on whether they thought the Obama fiscal expansion was a good or a bad thing, those who expressed an opinion overwhelmingly said yes. Very few said no. And in fact, if you look at the same survey, same question in 2014, basically there's just one person who says it was a bad thing. That was Alcina, who invented expansionary austerity. But there is no model that's generally accepted which shows that fiscal expansion is, fiscal tightening is expansionary, which is why you get results like this. So students are told it, academics believe it, and in fact I discuss in the book further evidence beyond this one survey that the majority of academic economists thought austerity was a bad thing, and that majority got bigger after it became clear that the Eurozone crisis was a Eurozone affair and had no knock-on implications for anybody else. Unfortunately, though, it was the very few who thought austerity was a good thing that got publicity in the media, along with city economists who tended to say markets demanded austerity. Now, you see quite a lot of city economists on the media, and there's a very good practical reason for that. And that is that if you you're a journalist and you ring a city economist up, you won't get told that actually they're in a lecture at the moment, you ring them back. They'll immediately respond because being on the media is a key part of their job description. So the media likes them and you see them a lot. And the other quality they have that people in the media like is that they hardly ever say, well, on the one hand, on the other. They're always sure, they're always confident about what they say. There's only one problem, though, or in fact two problems. First, they tend to be politically biased. And secondly, they overstate the importance of the market, or indeed the fickleness of the market. Talking up the power of the markets was not difficult after the global financial crisis. In the book, there's a piece which says how a lot of people seem to think that financial markets are like a fickle god. And city economists and other advisors are like the high priests, who gladly accept sacrifices, fees, and in exchange for these sacrifices, they will tell you the mood of this fickle god. And I wrote that piece after seeing a member of parliament talk to a city economist in exactly that way. But if you look at the hard evidence, it is clear that in fact the markets would have loved to buy even more government debt. Interest rates on government debt fell after 2010. And don't let sort of apologists for austerity tell you, oh, that's because of Osborne's austerity that interest rates fell. That's nonsense. If it was true that it's all because of Osborne's austerity, then when the Conservatives unexpectedly won the election and when Osborne became Chancellor in the coalition, you would expect interest to have reacted, interest rates to have fallen. Interest rates didn't move at all. They didn't care. So all the hard evidence suggests that there was no crisis, no impending crisis, indeed no vulnerability. But in 2010, the deficit haters in the Treasury, and they always are deficit haters in the Treasury, and Mervyn King found it politically convenient to talk up these imaginary fears about a debt crisis. Now, Tory governments are tempted by ideas from the City or right-wing economists, but there's only one, just one, occasion since Keynes wrote the general theory that a Conservative government has attempted austerity. And that was in 1981. Some of you remember the 364 economists who wrote a letter denouncing Thatcher's budget of that year, in the middle of a recession, a deflationary budget. But even that was crucially different from what happened in 2010. In 1981, the budget tightened by raising taxes rather than cutting spending. And that's much kinder to demand. Reduces demand, but not as much as if you cut spending. Secondly, the policy lasted just 2 years. Not only did it end, it was reversed after 2 years. The tragedy of Osborne's austerity is that it has never been reversed. It has continued and continued. As Patrick's already mentioned, my estimate of how much it cost, it's probably an underestimate by now, because those costs are continuing. And it could easily be more. It could be easily a lot more. So why did Osborne carry on a policy when the UK recovery failed to materialise in 2011 and 2012? Why didn't he do what Thatcher had done and reverse the policy? I think there are two reasons why he didn't reverse austerity. The first, again, Patrick's already mentioned, but I want to link to this general theme of neoliberalism. One of the key goals of neoliberalism is to shrink the state. And the problem that Osborne faced before 2010 is that there was no public desire to shrink the state further. Here's a British social attitude survey, regular annual survey. It asked, do you want to have higher taxes and higher spending? Do you want to have lower taxes and lower spending? Or do you want things just as they kind of are? And the purple line is people who want more spending, more taxes. It always asks the both, that's crucial. And you can see that it fell under Conservative government, and then it's beginning to pick up again. And you might think, hang on, 2010, the green line's well above. But the green line is not those people who want less taxes, less spending. That's the yellow line. The number of people who want that are tiny. You wouldn't think that from the general sort of media discussion, but that tells you rather more about the media discussion than about what people think. The green line is people who want things just about the same. So you can see there's just no appetite, given that yellow line, for a party to say, let's shrink the state. So austerity was a gift, which Osborne grabbed by pretending you had to reduce government spending because of the deficit. You could shrink the state by the back door. And this idea of what I call deficit deceit is a key part of neoliberal overreach. I mean, you can see exactly the same thing in the US. It's even clearer there because it's gone through various cycles. If you want to cut taxes for the rich, as Trump has done and Bush did it earlier, then bigger deficits, no problem at all. But then you argue that because the deficit has risen, you must cut public spending. Completely hypocritical. But you can only play that kind of deceit if you have a compliant media, a media that doesn't call you out. In the UK, a mixture of a predominantly right-wing press and a BBC that you can intimidate with threats of cut spending gave you that compliant media. The second part of the answer of why Osborne retained austerity while the recovery faltered is that the policy was remarkably popular. Labour started off with moderate criticism in the form of too far, too fast, if you remember that slogan. But because that played so badly, particularly after the so-called recovery in 2013, they ended up saying they were going to be tough on the deficit. They weren't as tough on the deficit as the Tories, but that was the rhetoric they felt they had to adopt. So why was austerity so popular? As I've already noted, a clear majority of academic economists rejected austerity. So why was this point of view not put forward by the media? The partisan right-wing press is one answer, but what is more surprising is the absence of an anti-austerity voice among broadcasters. This is outlined in great detail by two really good books by Laura Basu and the others by Mike Berry. And they look in sort of minute detail at coverage in the press and by broadcasters throughout that period. And it's just so clear that broadcasters accepted the austerity narrative. It seemed that broadcasters had become tired of experts long before Brexit. To repeat, this is not confined to the partisan press. Even Channel 4's Jon Snow berated Miliband for not mentioning the, I quote, biggest issue of all, by which he meant the deficit. It's therefore not surprising that most voters thought austerity was both inevitable and also the responsible policy for the government to pursue. While that reflected a disinterest by the media and experts, the third lie that I want to talk about actually shows a lack of interest in facts. The idea that the government could manage the economy better than Labour was based above all on a simple idea. The Tories were clearing up the mess Labour left. This line, repeated endlessly by politicians, went unchallenged not just by Labour, but also the rest of the media. It was our third lie, and what is more, it is an obvious lie if you just look at the numbers. Blue line is GDP per head growth. Red line is net borrowing. And huge increase in deficit was exactly the same time as the recession. It's clear what the causality is. But nevertheless, politicians, unchallenged by the media, kept saying Labour had been profligate. Now, if anyone wants to argue that that level of the deficit represented profligacy, then I'm happy to discuss it further in Q&A. In addition, before the 2015 elections, part of the third lie, BBC journalists noted that the economy was the Conservatives' strong card, because it was the only issue where the Conservatives were doing better in 2015 than they'd done in 2010. But they then went on to conclude that therefore the economy must be strong, if people think it's strong. But of course what they're only picking up is people knew the deficit was coming down, and so they thought that was a good thing. The idea that the economy was actually strong was just another lie. Few mentioned the reality of the slowest recovery in centuries, or the unprecedented decline in real wages. All that mattered was the deficit coming down. As a result, the media colluded with the Tories in describing the economy as strong, when in fact it was in dire straits. I remember on the blog, and other economists as well joined in and saying, look, just look at the numbers. The economy is in a terrible state. But no one took any notice of what we did. So voters chose a Tory government in 2010 because they thought it was better at managing the economy, an idea cultivated and reaffirmed by the media. They thought things would be much more stable under a Conservative government. But of course that was also a Conservative government that was the pledge to allow a referendum, which was the beginnings of the political chaos that we're now in. The book contains a post I wrote in March before the referendum. And because I'd gone through this experience with austerity, I did pretty well in predicting what was going to happen. The post, I think, was entitled Cameron's Chickens Coming Home to Roost. And I said, look, this referendum is not going to go well because the right-wing press, with the help of a few Leave economists, will muddy the waters on the economic pain of Brexit. It'll give people the excuse to think it's not obvious how it's going to go. The BBC will balance economic knowledge against make-believe. But voters could see for sure that freedom of movement stopped the government controlling immigration, control that Cameron himself said was essential. What I didn't predict was quite the extent to which the Leave side would go on telling lies. But having got away with it for the need for austerity and Labour profligacy, I guess they thought it was the natural thing to do. So to me, the Brexit result, although incredibly disappointing, was not a complete surprise. We've heard a lot of stories about Brexit and English exceptionalism, and certainly nationalism has been emphasised more and more since the referendum. How many times do we have to be told that we made it through World War II? But what you might call extreme neoliberalism also played an important part in motivating the leaders of Brexit. The desire to reduce regulations on labour and environment was for many in the Conservative Party more important than the freedom to trade. They still talked about free trade, but what actually meant was trade free from regulations rather than the freedom to trade. Brexit is actually my fourth and final big lie. It took me a bit of time to work that out because some neoliberals like Cameron and Osborne are against Brexit. But so there was a split in neoliberalism, if you like. But for a lot of the people pushing Brexit, neoliberalism is a key motivation. So it's the fourth big lie and the final act, I hope, of neoliberal overreach. It also combined the first and second big lies. A pretense that immigration was responsible for low wages and reduced access to public services, a pretense that mattered, I showed you the poll earlier, combined with the fact that this was actually caused by the second lie, austerity. And indeed it was all made possible by the third lie, the lies that allowed the Conservatives to win the 2015 election. By and large, neoliberals have no problem with immigration. So they have to pretend to, hence deceit. Or find a socially conservative minister, when I last checked, still our Prime Minister, to front the policy for them. But I think it's overreach, not just in a moral sense, because the policy involves deception on a grand scale, but also because the combination of austerity, which actually does reduce real wages and access to public services for most people, and the lie that it's all down to immigration, that combination is so dangerous. as we see with Nigel Farage. That is what happened with Brexit. The right-wing press groomed people to dislike the EU, and then just before the referendum, they started talking about EU immigrants rather than just immigrants with non-white faces. Here they are in all their glory. Together with a BBC that prioritised balance over its role to educate and inform, and Brexit was the result. In the US, the other country where neoliberalism is strong, there are many parallels with the UK. Instead of Brexit, they had the election of Donald Trump. And the media played a vital role in the election of Donald Trump, just as it played a vital role in giving us Brexit. For the right-wing press in the UK, substitute Fox News and talk radio in the US. But even if you put them to one side, Trump got much more coverage in the non-partisan media than any other candidate in the primaries. He was such good television. And in the actual election, the media talked more about Clinton's email server than any of the scandals and issues to do with Donald Trump. This is actually from the Berkman Klein Center, and basically it's the number of sentences in news bulletins talking about various things during the US election period in the mainstream media. And the dark blue line is discussion of Clinton scandals. The dark red line is discussion of Trump scandals. So it's twice as much talking about Clinton scandals. And then the light blue line is discussion of policies put forward by Clinton, and the pink line is discussion of policies put forward by Donald Trump. So you see that the media wanted to talk about scandals to do with Clinton rather than policies, but when it came to Donald Trump, they preferred to talk about his policies rather than his scandals. And if you want to know what these scandals involving Clinton were, well, this is where the main part of the graph comes in. It's basically all Clinton's email server. The biggest non-scandal ever, perhaps. Why is the non-partisan media so ineffective at challenging neoliberal deceit? A key part of the answer is balance. Balance works okay when both sides behave in reasonable honesty. It does not work when one side tells lies and the other doesn't. It does not work when one candidate is totally unsuitable for office and the other doesn't. And it does not work when one side tells lies and the other party doesn't challenge them. And as we see with these numbers, because the non-partisan media tends to think of itself as fairly left-wing, I think they overcompensate in their coverage. And you actually get non-balance as a result. The problem with balance is it can balance out the truth. The BBC actually recognises this on the issue of climate change, where earlier debates between climate change scientists and deniers have been replaced by recognition that climate change is happening, although that commitment is often honoured in its breach. But that change in policy would not have been won without intense pressure from the science community. And alas, we economists, or experts on trade agreements, or experts on the law, just don't have the same clout. This must change. There are, of course, differences between UK and US versions of neoliberal overreach. Instead of anti-immigration, you had a culture war on race to deflect your left-wing but socially conservative voters from rejecting two tax cuts for the rich. But more recently, you've seen immigration becoming important with Trump and the culture war becoming part of the Brexit story. The media, in the case of both Trump and Brexit, is not manufacturing consent, but instead playing a key role in electing a dangerous idiot as president and overthrowing a UK government. This is not normal. This is very dangerous. Is there any hope from all this gloom? Well, both the UK and the US are still democracies, although US democracy is seriously tainted by money and also by gerrymandering, and the UK is in danger of catching the same disease. But democratic change will only be more than a respite from a right wing that is steadily morphing into an authoritarian populist movement, if that change is radical. And that radical change must include controlling our authoritarian populist partisan media and emboldening our broadcast media to inform and educate rather than balancing lies with truth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. I'm now going to introduce Anne Pettifor. She's a member of the Progressive Economy Forum Council. She's the director of Crime. Her latest book is The Production of Money, explaining the nature of money in the monetary system. She's a co-author of the Green New Deal, and she's now writing a new book on how to pay for the new Green Deal.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Can you all hear me? There's a loudspeaker here, isn't there? Right, great. First of all, can I say that I share Patrick's admiration for the work that Simon has done and for his blog, and in particular for the care that he takes to share his own academic knowledge with a much wider audience. This is very unusual amongst academic economists. They tend to live, if I may say so, in ivory towers and very content to talk to each other, but not to talk to the world. Simon is not one of those sorts of economists. And of course, I agree with him on the issues that he's raised, the horror of the anti-immigration debate, and of course, around austerity. We're absolutely aligned. However, I just want to say that I disagree with him quite fundamentally on the question of journalists and whether or not they ought to be blamed. And I think he's being unfair to journalists. Can I just say that I've had experience of this? I've worked with left-wing politicians back in the 80s and 90s. I was at the GLC working with, amongst others, Francis Morel and Ken Livingstone, and they were all prone to blaming the media for all of their problems and their worries. And then they appointed a brilliant woman called Nita Clark, and Nita's job was to liaise with the media. And Nita was ferocious with these politicians. She told them they had to be honest, they had to be truthful. When they made mistakes, they had to own up to it. And she would give journalists the stories that they needed and they wanted. She understood their professional needs and she helped provide it. And I'll never forget being in a meeting with her and Ken Livingstone, and she said to Ken, "You're meeting the Queen." It was the business of opening up the barrage, and the Queen was coming. "You are going to get down on your knees and bow to the Queen." And he said, "Over my dead body will I do it?" "No, of course I'm not going to do that. You know, I'm a Republican." And she said, "Well, then I'm going to resign. You are going to get on your knees and bow to the Queen." Sure enough, he got on his knees, bowed to the Queen, front page of the Standard. After that, the media loved him. Right? So the point is, politicians have tended to, look for excuses and to blame the media for their own failures, and in particular their failures of communication. And I think that's unfair. And I want to say this, that I think really, the big problem, and There are good economists and there are sound economists, and Simon is quite right. There are many economists that warned about austerity, but there were economists that egged on the politicians. And I know that because I suffered from that. So I am, together with Professor Victoria Chick and Jeff Tiley, the co-author of something called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Osborne, which we published in 2010, in which we predicted that Mr. Osborne's austerity would increase the debt, would make things worse, not make them better. But of course that wasn't popular. It wasn't a popular point of view. Why? Because when Alistair Darling was Chancellor, a group of economists wrote to the Sunday Times and urged austerity. And they were very distinguished. People like Tim Besley, Roger Bootle, Howard Davis, Meghnad Desai, Charles Goodhart, John Milbauer, Danny Quah, Ken Rogoff, and Bridget Rosewell. And this letter in the Sunday Times got an awful lot of publicity. It was reproduced by all the other major newspapers. And they all warned of the failure of the Labour Party, the Labour government, to deal with the deficit. It was an attack on Alistair Darling. In the absence, they wrote, of a credible plan, there is a risk that a loss of confidence in the UK's economic policy framework will contribute to higher long-term interest rates and or a currency instability, which could undermine the recovery. This was written in 2009. In order to minimize this risk and support a sustainable recovery, the next government should set out a detailed plan to reduce the structural budget deficit more quickly than set out by Alistair Darling in the 2009 pre-budget report. The exact timing of measures should be sensitive to developments in the economy, particularly the fragility of the recovery. They gave themselves a little leeway there. However, in order to be credible, the government's goal should be to eliminate the structural current budget deficit over the course of a parliament, and there is a compelling case, all else equal, for the first measures beginning to take effect in the 2010-2011 fiscal year. They added that most of the deficit reduction should come from cuts in public spending and that any tax increases should be broad-based. So this was a letter that had profound impact on the debate, and it was signed by these very prominent, very important economists, right? And so I think that made it really tough for a Labour government, for the Labour government. And Alistair Darling was trying as hard as possible to manage the deficit, which of course was not his fault, which was not the fault of the government, but was as a result of the collapse of the financial system. And that kind of gets blanked out of the debate. That gets forgotten about very conveniently. But it gets worse than that, because it wasn't just these 20 really influential economists. It was Mervyn King, as Simon has pointed out. Now, Mervyn King is governor of the Bank of England, and he endorsed austerity. But even more importantly, it was Sir Nicholas Macpherson, permanent secretary at the Treasury. Now, George Parker in the Financial Times called him a hawkish Treasury Austerian. Simon rightly says the Treasury's always been Austerian, but honestly, Sir Nicholas Macpherson has a great deal to answer for. These are the people advising politicians, and politicians are not trained academics, not trained in economics on the whole, right? And they have authority with journalists who turn up to the Treasury briefings, right? After he'd retired, Nicholas Macpherson wrote, in the Financial Times, by the way, since the crash, Sir Nick has been he wrote, I see myself as one of a number of people in finance ministries, central bank regulators, in the UK and the United States, who failed to see the crisis coming. Now, I'm a bit smug about that because I wrote a book saying there was going to be a crisis. And the idea that the permanent secretary at the Treasury couldn't see what I could see seemed to me to be a great weakness. So they failed to see the crisis coming, and they failed to spot the build-up of risk. This was, he said, a monumental collective intellectual error. And I have to give Nicholas Macpherson due respect here. He tells the truth. It is a monumental collective intellectual error. And it's really wrong to blame the journalists for this. They're just simply the storytellers, the communicators. the intellectual error is happening at the heart of government. And in that interview, the FT says that since the crash, Sir Nick has been an enthusiastic advocate of austerity and supports George Osborne's target of an absolute surplus by 2020. It is entirely sensible, he says. I've only had 4 years in 31 at the Treasury when there has been a surplus. If you don't aim to get the surplus, you'll never get there. So, you know, these are very distinguished and important people arguing for austerity. Naturally, the newspapers, the journalists are going to pick up from that. You know. But it wasn't just him. It was, as Simon has said, Alberto Alesina, who was a favourite amongst fiscal hawks. And it was his hour. He went to Madrid in 2010 and told the European Union's economic and finance ministers that large, credible and decisive spending cuts to rescue budget deficits have frequently been followed by economic growth. He was influential enough to be cited in the official communique of the EU finance ministers' meeting. And he seems to have also, of course, he did influence the former president of the ECB, Jean-Claude Trichet. And that wasn't just him. There was also Ken Rogoff at Harvard University, who said that the right limit for spending was 90%, government debt was 90% of GDP. This was picked up by Paul Ryan, the Republican in the United States. It was picked up here by George Osborne, and it was picked up by Mrs. Merkel. So the thing is, what we have here are economists arguing for a set of ideas, and powerful economists and politicians adopting those ideas, accepting those ideas. So I think we have to go to the source of the collective, the monumental collective error, and not blame the message givers, the communicators, not blame the messengers. And I think, you know, if we look at what we have in Germany right now, German economists are beginning to have second thoughts about their debt break. They are openly mocked by American economists, the head of the Institute of International Finance, whose name is Robin Brooks. Now, the Institute for International Finance in Washington is the bankers' headquarters bank. That's where all the bankers convene under the umbrella of the Institute of International Finance. You cannot get a more conservative financial institution than that. And Robin Brooks is the chief economist and is now accusing European policymakers of failing miserably because they will not spend, because they will not revive the very weak economy across the European Union. But, you know, it's almost too late, because what's happened is that monumental intellectual error has been embedded in law. We have the debt break, which is a German law. We had balanced budgets, the things that governments are committed to. We had a charter for fiscal responsibility here. So, you know, these ideas take shape, and they take deep shape, and the media are the communicators of those ideas. They're not the source of them. So I just want to put in a good word for the media. There's an awful lot wrong in all of those ghastly front pages that you showed. Simon, you're absolutely right. That is awful. But if I go back and I think about Nita Clark and Ken Livingstone, I know that it is possible to communicate well your own ideas, but you have to get the thing right. You have to have intellectually sound ideas in order to be able to get the media on side. Thank you very much.
Simon respond to that later, I think. I've just read from Robert Skidelsky that Avicenna is still at it, and although he's just published a new book saying that cuts can be expensive. Now we're going to hear from Maya Goodfellow. She's a writer, researcher, academic who frequently contributes to The Guardian. She focuses on British politics, immigration, the history of empire, gender and race. She's a graduate teaching assistant, doctorate candidate at SOAS. She's the author of Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats, and that will be coming out soon.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I will just actually say I've now passed my PhD, so I'm just going to claim the title of doctor. I mean, I don't need applause for that. Yeah, so I've been working on a book about immigration for the past 2 years, so I'm going to touch upon some of the arguments that were made around immigration in particular, but I want to join Anne as well in saying how great it is, having spent the past 3 years also in academia doing my PhD, how important it is to have people communicating their ideas from inside the academy to a wider audience. It's not something that everyone does. It's something I think actually too few people do. So to have someone like Simon communicating some really important ideas in an accessible way, I think is incredibly important. And I think that that is perhaps nowhere more important for me than on this issue of immigration. So it was really good to hear that as the kind of headline lie that was going to be dealt with. And I'm going to basically very briefly pick up on a couple of things that were said, talk about why I think they're important, but also maybe where I would go a bit further or maybe look at it in a slightly different way. And I think two of the key points that we heard in Simon's lecture is one, this idea that numbers are relevant. So it's numbers of immigrants coming into the country that produces anti-immigration sentiment. That was quite well tackled, I think. And I think that that is a really important thing to keep in our minds, because those numbers in and of themselves actually have very, very little meaning, and they have to be given political meaning. They have to be given that political content. And I would actually say that that doesn't just happen in the media. Maybe, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's not the media at all. I think that it is, but I actually think it's our politicians as well that help to give those numbers some kind of meaning. I'll talk a bit about why in a moment. But I actually think as well as, yes, it's tied up with Brexit, but for my own book, I went and looked at this history of the debate, and I kind of unearthed some of these debates from the 60s and 70s, and I was really struck by something that the great academic Stuart Hall said in the late 1970s. He said, if you focus on the numbers, no matter what those numbers are, they are always too much. Any amount of number is too much when you're focusing on the numbers of people coming into the country, because there is an implicit idea that those people are a problem and they are going to create a problem for this country. And I think that what is incredibly important for that is this idea that the response to immigration is a natural reaction. So anti-immigration sentiment is bred by a natural reaction to immigrants coming into the country. And I think that we know that to be untrue, but that is something that has been so widely disseminated in our public sphere. And so from that, something that we hear a lot is, and we heard in the lecture, which I think is important, is this idea that, you know, the financial crisis was caused by Labour spending and mishandling of the economy. The other big fallacy, actually, that I think is still accepted is that the reason we ended up with Brexit and the reason that we've ended up with parties like UKIP doing incredibly well is because New Labour simply let too many people in. And the problem with that argument is that entirely ignores what was going on in the country at the time in terms of the political debate. And this idea that New Labour as a government was very welcoming to immigrants, well, actually, as soon as they came into office, almost as soon as they came into office, they were carrying out an agenda that was incredibly anti-refugee, anti-asylum seeker. And in the public's mind, these things are not always easy to disentangle. So if you talk about asylum seekers as coming into the country and not being genuine and coming in and causing social problems, you do feed the politics that anti-immigration sentiment is structured around. So, and that is almost never discussed in our public debate when New Labour are talked about and this rise of anti-immigration sentiment. So I think it's incredibly important to hear this idea about it not just being the numbers. And I think that the other thing that is incredibly important is this idea that immigration is bad for the economy, and that being patently untrue. Immigration has not caused the collapse in our public services, has not caused low wages in any significant way. And I think this is where we can really quite nicely, somewhat depressingly, see how it's not just the media, but it is our politicians who have supported that very myth. So yes, we have the Conservative Party really going full throttle on that very idea, but we also actually had a Labour Party with Ed Miliband, unfortunately, though he tried to deal with that issue, it dealt with it very badly. And Labour went into the 2015 general election talking about needing to limit the number of benefits that people could claim. And whether they liked it or not, that was a message that migration was causing a problem for the economy. And I will always remember the mug which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the Controls on Immigration mug. And I recall at the time of the general election, Ed Balls being asked about this because there was a lot of unhappiness from the membership, but also from some of the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party, about the mug and about this pledge to control immigration. And he said, on election night, I will be drinking out of that mug, celebrating a Labour victory. And he did go on to lose his seat. I don't think that's necessarily a positive thing, but I think it tells us something about how badly calculated the idea was that if you pander a bit on this message that immigration is a problem for the economy, then you're going to win some votes. It didn't turn out that way for Ed Balls, and it didn't turn out that way for the Labour Party. And I think actually what is interesting about that on this issue of austerity that is incredibly depressing and incredibly important to really make sense of is the way the image of the migrant being bad for the economy is actually fits with the people who they are pitted against. So you have the migrants who come in and they take from the public purse and they take people's jobs and they're bad for public services. But you also have the benefit scrounger who doesn't work hard enough and who is helping to cause economic problems within Britain. But that is the working class migrants often and the working class Britons being pitted against one another in the debate. They're both supposedly competing for the same jobs the migrant takes from the so-called indigenous British worker. But they are also both the figures of hate within the austerity debate. They are both scapegoated for problems caused that they have not caused at all. And I think that overlap actually has continued, even though the language of the benefit scrounger is far less prevalent in our political discourse. What we see is this discussion around it being the working classes who dislike immigration. It's working class discontent. But very rarely is that what the working class understood to be really dissected. It certainly doesn't take into account the fact that we have a multiracial working class with very, very diverse views on some of these issues. And I think that actually that is one of the most pernicious narratives that continues to be perpetuated in our media, that it's the liberal elite that like immigration, and it's everyone else at the bottom of society who doesn't. And this is maybe where I'm maybe not quite as optimistic on where we are or where we're going. It's true that public opinion has shifted, and I do hope that we do move forward positively and take on some of these narratives. I think that part of the reason for that shift is also to do with the coverage, yes, to do with Windrush as well, thinking about how the debate has been somewhat humanized, at least for a moment. But I also think that it's very complicated and it's very hard to tell exactly what is going to happen, whether that public opinion is going to continue to improve in some way. But I think that in some people's mind, leaving the EU means that immigration will go down, even if it isn't. Not everyone is totally clued up on how, because it's very complex, how the immigration system works. And I've spoken to numbers of people who think that the EU controls non-EU immigration in Britain. And I think actually that does matter for us because the immigration system is complex, because how it is framed in the debate is not easy to always understand. These things are conflated, and so is it a case that people's views of immigration are going to continue to improve? I hope so. I'm not entirely convinced, and the reason why I'm not entirely convinced is that there has not been a significant enough political shift in how immigration is talked about. It's being talked about less. If any of you saw Nigel Farage very recently on the BBC talk bit on Andrew Marr, I think it was, being quizzed about, why aren't you talking about immigration so much? And he said, I'm talking about democracy. Yes, they've given that a bit of a back seat. That doesn't mean that it won't be reintroduced again into the debate when it is politically convenient for them to do so. And I think it's arguably bad, it's very bad, that essentially freedom of movement has been accepted as a bad thing, in that almost everyone in politics is saying it needs to be ended, apart from some political parties. But even those that are on the Remain side, Vince Cable and Andrew Marr on last Sunday, I think, saying, we should have freedom of movement as a principle, but immigration has caused problems in this country. The fact that we are in a position where one of the leading Remain parties is still reinforcing that narrative about immigration being bad, I think is a problem for us. And just two final points. The other reason why I am not so optimistic is I think actually some of the root causes of where our anti-immigration sentiment comes from has not been dealt with. Some of the economic arguments have been to some extent, But actually, maybe this is where I would go slightly further, is because I don't see these sentiments as new in any way whatsoever. I think they're intimately bound up with racism in Britain. I think the two cannot be separated. And the reason I think that is because if you look at the history of the debate, which migrants are marked out as unwelcome is racialized. Yes, it's shifted because of EU migration, but even that debate about people from Eastern Europe, that is racialized if you dissect the way that it is articulated in our media and by our politicians. And so there's a difference between saying, I want to call people who dislike immigration racist and xenophobes, and saying racism is a factor in this debate. It shapes our policy and it shapes our rhetoric. What do we do about it? And that is one of the biggest lies that the media has told. They have said, when you say people are wrong to dislike immigration, you are calling them a racist. There is a difference between calling whole groups of people racists, which may or not be true, and saying, how do we address the racism that is embedded in this debate and in this policy? And that is where we need to start. And so I think that it's really important to be tackling some of these mistruths that Simon has taken on, and maybe going that one step further, that he mentioned about this culture war. That is where the debate is also at. The idea of British culture being ruined by immigration, I don't think that argument is going to disappear, and I do fear a resurgence of that depending on what happens with Brexit. So I share there's a degree of optimism there, but I think also a degree of caution about where we go from here. There needs to be a wholesale taking on of some of these very arguments that have underlaid the anti-immigration sentiment in British politics for about 50 years, and that hasn't happened yet. Okay, thank you.
I'm now going to hand over to Professor Erin Davis. Professor Davis is Deputy Head of the Media Communications and Cultural Studies Department at Goldsmiths University, the author of Reckless Opportunists, Elites at the End of the Establishment, and he's a leading commentator on the state of the British media and opportunism amongst our political leaders.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me along, and very glad to be on a panel with the three people at the table. All of who do some great work. I'm going to give the media angle, and I guess I have to disagree with Anne and agree with Simon on this one. I mean, on the one hand, not entirely. It's the way I put it is, if you see surveys of journalists, I haven't seen any recent ones, but they tend to be more left than right, quite often by a larger amount, or small Labour, small left, centrist. But it's about how the media is constructed. It's the systems in which journalists operate in these days, which is part of the problem, or a large part of the problem. And if you talk about the general media, and if anyone who's a media scholar, this is quite introductory stuff. But if anyone has really critically looked at our British media over the last 20 or 30 years, it's very hard to argue anything other than that. It's it's clearly right-wing in its content and output overall, despite having some very good journalists and very good investigations and alternative people who come up with different things. In the main, it's fairly right-wing. It's also increasingly incapacitated. It's the business model of journalism has broken down over a 30-year period, and that's especially sped up over the last 10 years. And all those kinds of things makes it very hard for the media to properly address and investigate and report complex subjects like the economy. Starting with the general picture, just to go through, the systems, the sort of filter systems, as Herman and Chomsky put it, which cause our media, despite whatever journalists want to write about and where they are, to become more right-wing. In this country, there's a long history of billionaire, clearly right-wing owners of our media. We have an increasing process of concentration. The latest figures show that by circulation, our national news media, just 3 companies account for 83% of consumed national news content, just 3. Daily Mail being one of those 3, and Murdoch's News Corporation being another. 80% of local news is accounted for by just 5 companies. Hundreds of local newspapers, news outputs, just 5 companies account for all those. But there are a number of other things in terms of the funding of news, in terms of the sourcing of news, in terms of the public relations industry and the advertising industry. Again, if you look at where advertising comes from, if you look where the public relations industry comes from, predominantly employed by the corporate sector, the financial sector, and government. They are also the biggest advertisers in national newspapers. There's a whole list of things. There's a whole series of reasons why news primarily follows a certain agenda. And the last one is about sources. And in every single study, going back decades, there's one sort of rule of journalism content. It's always that a select group of elite sources dominate pretty much every sector of news in every environment. Primary definers, since we're mentioning Stuart Hall, who made this observation back in the 70s, but it's been repeated. A certain select group of primary definers define the news in certain areas. And this is reflected in all sorts of ways, and one of which is election studies. Loughborough University, Cardiff, there are others. Loughborough does an election study, every election looking at content, every single election going back to 1992. The coverage is very much tilted in the Conservatives' favour, even in 1997. It varies, sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, but in terms of who gets interviewed, what are the agendas, the things that they choose to focus on, the negativity, all those things, it's always heavily geared towards Conservatives and against Labour. This was especially strong in the 2015 election. In the 2017, which was slightly odd, which was incredibly negative to politicians of all sides, but according to the Loughborough study, Conservatives, despite all the negative attention, still had a small sort of surplus of positive articles. There was negative 225 articles over a 4-week period. That's when you take away everything positive. And perhaps one of the most telling statistics was the 2016 referendum. Again, if we look at the history of the British press, it either ignores Europe, has been very negative towards Europe for a number of decades. And there are several studies over the years which show this. But the 2016 referendum by Loughborough, again, the Election Studies Unit, found that roughly half the election coverage in the national news put forward an opinion of whether leaving or staying was good. Of that 50% of articles, that's across all newspapers, 82% were in favour and argued to leave the EU, 82%, which is a pretty high number. There are other issues with our general media, one of which is the decline of the business model, which I've talked about, but also trust. Trust has been incredibly low in our news media for a number of decades. The British seem to think we have a very good media. It's not corrupt. It's not one of those problem medias in those developing economies somewhere. But actually, in world surveys, time after time, or European surveys, British trust in its own media comes pretty much near the bottom. 2010 to 2014, the last World Values Survey that was completed, out of 55 countries, we came 54th in terms of trust levels of our own media. So, of course, when you get to 2016, people aren't trusting much at all. And I'll come back to the issue. I'll move on briefly to economic news. Because economic news, again, is presented as something more technical, more objective, full of experts more often. But the reality is, having studied it over the years, it's even more partial than mainstream political news in many, many respects. Not because of control from the top, but for a number of structural reasons. For those structural reasons, you have things like advertising and PR again. In the 1980s and 1990s, a number of studies of the rising public relations industry. The high point of that growth in the British public relations industry was not in politics, it was in finance. The highest taker of public relations material wasn't the Sun or the Mirror, it was the Financial Times. Because of this concerted public relations and advertising, which have kept the economic news side of things going, and that dominance, the voices, as Simon pointed out, predominantly have come from the city, have come from the Treasury, the Bank of England, and top CEOs. And again, if you see study after study of the key sources reporting, those groups have come to dominate. They're the dominant voices, the dominant advertisers, the dominant suppliers of public relations material, and the most interested audiences. So if you survey the public, economic business news comes very low down in terms of their interests. But in terms of these elite groups, it comes very high up. And the issue with that is, on the one side, we've lost these alternative voices. You go back to the 70s, 80s, trade unions, economists and academic departments, various interest groups, alternative economic think tanks, these have all been squeezed out of this mainstream economic discourse. But on the other hand, you also get a closing down of debate amongst these key sources. And for me, it's become a circular debate amongst a particular group of sources with overlapping interests. And if you think about the Treasury and the Bank of England, the people in the city, they overlap on a number of things. They overlap, as we know, on things like small state, anti-trade union, markets are best, global free trade is best, a number of those things. But they also, when you talk to them, when you look at the content, they're very anti any alternative economic thinking, Keynesianism, anything. It doesn't come up. It's not to be discussed. They're also, even more than the press, quite strongly, or incredibly strongly anti-Labour. If you see surveys of the business community or the city community, if you go back to the 1980s, at each election, between 1% and 2% of the city voted Labour. Even in 1997, after this protracted prawn cocktail offensive by Labour in the city and trying to get the business community on side, in 1997, just 7% of the city voted for Labour. So they never really accepted them. If we come up to 2015 and the Miliband election, just 6% were in favour of a Labour or Labour-run government. 89% in favour of a conservative-led government. The final point to make about this is also the way this discussion has gone. There's the discussion, and this relates to the idea of experts and the narrowing of the debate, has become very much about seeing Britain and discussing Britain as an investment opportunity. Chancellors and CEOs present and sell companies and sectors in Britain, and other people comment, and investors, international investors, comment and view those companies in England and Britain and everything else, whether or not it's an investment opportunity. And what we end up is a discussion of the economy in terms of grander figures of GDP or inflation or employment or the FTSE 100 level. And when you come down and look at it, most of these things don't account for huge variations, huge inequalities in regions and employment, precarious employment. The inflation figures don't take into account the ever-increasing costs of housing and renting. Many factors for everyday people's lives and the economy are just not reflected in economic news. So we got to a point in 2016, the arguments about the economy getting terrible, well, for large parts of Britain in the north and the regions, the economy was already terrible. Wages have been stagnating. They couldn't afford housing for a decade or two. So why would they believe this argument about things were going to get worse? What did they have to lose? Why would they, when Gove said, who believes experts? Well, they'd long ago stopped believing in these so-called experts, the city economists, telling us how great it was. Okay, my final point is, or the final thing to talk about is, what do we do about it? And well, on the one hand, it's about this kind of debate. It's about having alternative think tanks, and a whole lot have developed in the last 5 or 10 years. I'm aware of many such initiatives to try and discuss economic history, other forms of economic thinking. But also, as Simon pointed out, and I know this personally, we have to get much better at accessing the media, at talking to the media. We like to sit in our office. We don't like to publicise ourselves. We need to do a lot more to get out there and to put a different message out there. Alternative media has been a great forum for that, like Simon's blog. Would you have got such coverage in the mainstream media ever? Who knows? But there are now many alternative forums to try and make use of. The second thing is we really do need to look at our mainstream media. It's so much worse, so much more corrupted than is in the public debate. You can see every time politicians try and do something about it, it's clamped down. After the Leveson inquiry, the recommendations which were voted through Parliament didn't happen. It was quite astonishing. It was put through Parliament, and the recommendations for better regulation and accountability to the media never happened, and nothing happened about it, having passed all the way through. But we need a proper commission to look at our media in terms of its funding, because the funding model has collapsed in many, many sectors, which is producing very poor news, even if we haven't noticed it. We need to look at true journalist autonomy, true freedom of the press, because we don't really have that, and true accountability. All those things need to be tackled. We also need to take on the tech giants who are just as concentrated, just as evasive of regulation, or far more evasive of regulation and contributing to the problems. There's a whole set of things, but we just need to acknowledge the problems. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, hello, I'm Camilla. I'm a housewife from Gloucestershire, so thank you for a very educational talk. Last night I went, like Daniel, into the Lion's Den to a Brexit Party rally, so-called, in Gloucester, the last one for the South West, with Anne Widdecombe as the star speaker. And I have to tell you, I feel very much as if I'm in a London elite bubble, an academic bubble, because last night I was surrounded by the what I would normally expect to meet at Gloucester Rugby Club, cheering and waving banners for the Brexit Party. And I fear that trying to spread messages through the mainstream media is shutting the gate after the horse has bolted, because there was a huge amount of talk about how they don't trust it, they want to get into power, take the licence fee away from the BBC, shut down Channel 4, they don't trust the newspapers, we were encouraged to jeer at The Guardian. They then went on to talk extensively about how they operate on social media. And I just don't think the messages that academics like yourselves will reach that core audience. And I just wondered what the panel thought they could do to dumb themselves down, really, to make videos for YouTube and, you know, economics 101, you're being had by the rich guys kind of stuff. I just wondered if you had any comments, really.
Okay. Microphone down here, please.
Thanks very much for the talk, very interesting. I was just wondering whether, and this is more from an economics point of view, but also in terms of how it's communicated into the media, whether the introduction of something like a well-being index or other alternative measures that could help to get some attention and provide viable alternatives to sort of cold GDP figures that don't take into account all the stagnation and inequality that you have described. So what kind of indices or measures would you say should be introduced, like both well-being or more granular things? And two, how do you think those can be effectively incorporated into a sort of communication strategy from everyone who wants to see those taken up? Thank you.
Great. Let's take one more question and then we'll go to the panel. Take this one at the front.
Thank you very much for the speeches. I just wonder, with the economists and the media, whether it's the ideology that follows the idea of austerity rather than austerity being sort of, and that's what the media and the economists and the politicians have in common. And with so much stress on immigration, how much do you think is really featuring, whether it's on the left or the right, of preserving whiteness in a sort of a white supremacy or white privilege sort of way?
Okay, right. I got a loud voice anyway, so. I think I would start on what's easy. And what's easy is reaching the other 70% rather than the 30% of core Farage supporters. It's exactly the same in the US. You have 30% of people who think Trump is wonderful, whatever he does. He famously said he could shoot someone in Times Square, and they think, and that's true. They're very hard. And I don't think you're going to get anywhere by trying to appeal to them. I think you have to start with the 70%. That's fatalistic, but I think it's realistic. One of these interesting, thinking that having a different indicator will somehow, it's a magic bullet. I know you didn't say this, but it's kind of implicit in what some people say. Well-being has steadily improved since 2010, nationally. Average well-being. Now, there are good reasons for that. Employment is very high. But the idea that if only we looked at some kind of well-being index, then suddenly every problem would show itself. It's just simply not the case. I think there is a place for well-being index. But, I think one of the comments that I was really telling was when, some colleagues were fighting the good fight on Brexit, and to an audience, and I think this has sort of been quoted by various different people, but I talked to one of the people who was actually there, and someone said, well, maybe these things are improving your GDP, but they're not improving ours. And I think a lot of the problem there is just distortion of those figures. And we didn't have a recovery from the recession, because a true recovery is when you catch up from what you've lost in a recession. That's what recovery really means. And we never have done that. We just about got back to trend growth in some quarters. That's not a true recovery. But the idea is abused by the media. And, this idea that the economy was strong in 2015. So I don't think GDP is the problem. It's the way that people abuse the concept. But of course, we shouldn't be talking about GDP. We should, I use that £10,000 worth of resources that were lost by austerity per adult household. I use that number because people relate to it. People can't relate to GDP. So I think that's another important point to make. Okay.
Aaron, do you want to come back on those points?
I'll start with the social media question and our bubble. And yes, of course, we are in a bubble. And unfortunately, if you look at studies here in America, the bubbles are getting more deeper. And social media is very much a part of that. And it's quite amazing when you see the charts of how separate these bubbles are, especially in America, with Republicans only looking at Republican media, websites, etc. They don't know anything else. And hardcore Democrats, it's the same issue. And we have the same thing here, obviously. Social media saved Corbyn, I would say. If you look at the studies, how it helped the Brexit side, it's also it saved Corbyn in 2017 because the mainstream media did the reverse. But I think, to me, mainstream media still counts a lot. Because up until recently, and I think it's still the case, most people have more regard for TV, actually, in making up their minds about who they vote and their general idea of the candidates. And that most social media stories which get circulated come from mainstream media. They're not created. 98% or something of the core material comes from mainstream media. So we need to support mainstream media as that knock-on effect. Yes. In terms of measures, I mean, I'm not quite sure I agree with Simon there. Of course, you have to have a snapshot. The problem is most people are not interested in economic news. Journalists know that. Why are we going to report the economy when we're losing viewers and readers anyway? We're hemorrhaging stuff. So why are we going to cover something that's dull, complex, no one can understand anyway? But I think we need to try. We certainly need to show a set of measures. And I think, housing costs, those things are just not in there. We talk about employment being as high as it's ever been, but you can also see, but you have to look a lot further down, that precarious employment is as high as it's ever been. And in-work poverty is as high as it's been as a proportion, although Simon will know the figures better than me. But those things need to be in the public debate, but they're not enough in the mainstream discourse. So I would like to see those measures somehow incorporated and included in more mainstream discussions, but I'm not quite sure how.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't have a hugely good answer for the person at the back who asked about that. I think it is a concern. I think that you should be trying to spread your net as widely as possible. And I actually think this point about the 2017 general election, I had to stop listening to Radio 4's Today programme, so I switched to Radio 1 for good, at least until now. And so during the 2017 election, I was listening to that radio station, and actually what was incredibly effective, I don't know the impact of this, but it's just something that Stephen Bush at the New Statesman's commented on, I observed myself, is that Labour had a constant drip of policies every day. In the news segment, it would be, we're going to have more bank holidays, or they're going to tax the very richest slightly more and pay for public investment. And I do think that that does have an impact on how people understand politics. If you're reaching them in spaces that are not inherently politicised, actually that can be incredibly effective in those periods where there's a general election. And people do vote for all kinds of different reasons. They might hold views that I really don't agree with, but they're still going to vote for the same political party as me because of X issue in their life. So I think it's, to some extent, you don't necessarily, there's some people I guess you can just in some way write off because of the thing that is driving them is so deeply problematic. But for a lot of people, that isn't the case. But I guess also, and this is a really, maybe it's a bit of a cop-out is the answer, but it's something that I often say because I believe it, is that it is also long-term change. The reason that some of those narratives are possible is because we don't understand our history well enough. Actually, if we can equip people to not only make sense of the news and challenge it, but also to know their history better, then you're not going to fix all these problems, but you're at least going to have a population that understands the nation in a more in a more meaningful way than the kind of vision we're sold. And I think that relates directly to the point that was asked here about whiteness. And I mean, I could go on about it forever. My PhD was about whiteness. But I think that is a significant problem in Britain. It's not something we talk about. We talk about racism. Racism is bad, is what the newspapers say. But then, someone said something racist. Was it really racist? Is it bad? But never do we get to this issue of whiteness in Britain and actually how that is so deeply embedded in people's sense of the nation, and how whiteness is this shifting thing. It's not just tied to skin color, it's tied to so many other things. And if we were to really interrogate that, to really interrogate Britain's history of empire and how that shapes the present, how Britain is not just a developed country because it was industrious and had all these innate positive qualities, how it took from the colonies to fund its own industrial revolution, and how the labour of the colonies funded prosperity here, and Britain still benefits from that global inequality that is deeply related to those relations of empire. If we could talk about that more and we could embed that in our education system, I think we'd have some positive movement. But maybe I'm also I'm wedded to this idea that we need to teach empire. So maybe I'm kind of obsessed with that to some extent.
I have to absolutely agree with that. But it was also extraordinary to see the reaction to the image of Prince Harry's new baby and the grandmother in the room, and the abuse that that family has suffered. I want to say this, that, you know, I don't think we should patronize the public. We really should not do that. People are mad as hell, not just here in Britain, but around the world. Today, President Modi has just been elected with an increased majority. And that's because the world has become more unstable, more volatile, more dangerous, and where living standards have fallen, where, you know, we've had a massive global financial crisis. The rich and the people who originated that crisis were bailed out by the central banks, and the rest of us have had to face austerity, not just here, but in the United States, in Europe, in India, in the Philippines, wherever you look, the rise of these authoritarian figures responding to the anger, the real anger that you saw in Gloucester last night, you know. And I'm not saying we should pander to that, and I agree that maybe it's only 30%, but those people are justifiably angry. Their children can't afford to buy a house. They can't afford, and there is no social housing. Their children can't afford to go to university. They don't have secure jobs. They have more than one job, and they can see the 1% doing really, really well. And for me, that's the fundamental thing, that, you know, globalization, neoliberal dollarized globalization has created these conditions of massive instability, massive inequality, and we're all sitting here thinking it's terribly puzzling that people have become racist and angry, right? It's not in the least bit puzzling. It happened in the 1930s, we know. This is the point about history. We know that if you do this to people, if you allow the gold standard to manage the market globally and to say to people, sorry, but your politicians can have no say over policy, it's decided by some remote market, you know, the value of your exchange rate, your interest rates, the major levers in your economy are determined by we don't know who, not to do with politicians. Our politicians are pretty helpless. You know, they have been stripped of powers, and people are mad as hell about that. And we should, you know, I just feel we can't patronize them. They have a real reason to be angry. And we've got to address those inequalities. We've got to address that unfairness. And I think if we did that, not just here, but internationally, you would find these big authoritarian figures would lose their base. But we don't do that. To be honest, I don't agree with that. And I want to say this about the 2017 election and Labour's policy proposals. That was extraordinary. That showed that people, you know, weren't there. I mean, you know, Jeremy Corbyn isn't exactly a charismatic sort of celebrity type film star, but he just issued policies that people immediately liked. And immediately, the public opinion changed. And I think that says something about the intelligence of the electorate, really. So it doesn't have to be in language they understand. It has to be policies that are actually going to make a real and qualitative difference to their life standards.
Right, some more questions, please. Some more questions. Microphones. Here. And then you.
So I wanted to ask, in the wake of the European elections, and in the wake of the results, there's going to be a lot of talk by politicians and a lot of spin kind of by the media. And I was wondering if you guys had any predictions of what might be said by the media and any particular lies that we might want to watch out for in the next coming weeks.
Chris Giles from the Financial Times, so I'm part of the complicit or corrupted media here. So it's really a question for Simon. When we look back at 2010 and the forecasts for the economy that were contemporary at the time, there were two monumental errors that were made. One you've highlighted was that we were far too optimistic about the UK economic performance generally in terms of growth. We were far too pessimistic about the recovery in the employment market. And so that suggests that actually the effect of austerity on the economy is rather more complicated than the story that is sometimes told, particularly by you here tonight. And so the question is, are you not in some ways doing exactly what you criticise the Conservatives of doing, blaming Labour for the financial crisis, which I agree is an absurd thing to do, by saying that all of our economic problems are caused by austerity.
And one more. Gentleman here, please.
Thank you. We're about to get a new Prime Minister, apparently. Keep looking at the watch, maybe we'll get developments through any moment now. Hopefully what we might get is a change of government in the not-too-distant future. And I noticed that we are talking with people who belong to the Progressive Economy Forum. I just wonder how progressive things can be. I mean, would, for example, it make sense to abolish the Treasury and just have a small department that keeps the accounts and everything, and also to limit the activity of the Bank of England? And what on earth is the MPC, Monetary Policy Committee? What's that all about?
Right, Simon, would you like to get stuck into that, please?
Yes. So, I tend to focus on output when I'm talking about austerity. That's the amount of resources the economy generates. Now, you're absolutely right that actually employment that we did have unemployment. It wasn't as bad as we might have expected. And then in 2013 or wherever it started coming down. And so if you just looked at employment, things would not look too bad. Although, Aaron's point about the type of employment for many people is, it's true for those people. But output is the important variable, because the good employment prospect is the same as the terrible productivity performance that we've experienced. Once the ratio of the other two. So a good employment outcome just means your productivity has been terrible, which means your real wages are terrible. So, I just don't get this, employment's okay, so let's not worry about it. Employment being okay means productivity has been terrible. And it makes no sense whatsoever to say, employment is okay, so let's not worry about austerity. I just don't think that's a tenable argument. But it's made a lot. I actually was part of a group that Bob Kerslake presided over, which looked at the issue of should we get rid of the Treasury. And that has been tried, setting up a Department of Economic Affairs. And the trouble is that, the Treasury kind of control the purse strings. Someone's got to control the purse strings of how much individual departments spend. And so what happens is that within Cabinet, Treasury rather than Department of Economic Affairs dominated. I think what you have to do with the Treasury, and it does need serious reform, is you need to strengthen the people who actually look at macroeconomics in the Treasury. Because one of my experiences, I started writing the blog for 6 months, and I went along to the Treasury because they asked me to, or rather the people working in the Treasury, not the senior guys, asked me to give a talk. And I was expecting 30 or so, because that's all about, there aren't many more macroeconomists than that. And 100 people, 100 junior economists turned up. And it was absolutely clear that they were sick of austerity, and they wanted to hear someone telling them that they were right to be sick of it. So I think if you give those people power such that the macro department can overrule the public spending department within the Treasury, then that's what you should do about the Treasury. I won't talk about Bank of England and independent monetary policy, because that's a whole big debate, and I know other people disagree, so I wouldn't abolish the Bank of England. Okay.
Right, so we're running out of time. Has anyone got any very strong views about those questions?
I've got something very brief to say. Just on the predictions thing, I don't know, obviously. But I think it's interesting to think about that one of the biggest mistruths, I think, that happened directly after Brexit, and I wonder if it will be revived in the wake of the European elections, perhaps not, is this idea that it was a working class revolt that produced the Brexit result. Actually, academic analysis from people like Danny Dorling shows that that is inaccurate. It's not only the working class or the working class in its entirety that drove that vote. It's also affluent people in the South, and that is totally overlooked in that debate. And I suppose that's where I maybe slightly disagree with something that was said before. This idea that if you people do have a reason to be angry, but people's racism does not just come from their economic insecurity. And I think that that's a problem that we encounter time and again, is that actually we might fix the economic circumstances. For some people, that might deal with some of their grievances, but for a lot of people, it won't, because we live in an institutionally racist society and we are producing and reproducing racisms all the time. And that's why I mentioned this issue of whiteness is something that Omar Khan from the Runnymede Trust, the race equality think tank, says, and I'm going to steal it because I think it's a really good line, is that the working class, the white working class, right, which always erases the rest of the working class that is multiracial, the white working class dislikes immigration, is racist. It's this caricature that is revived time and again in our media and by our politicians and in our general political discourse. It's not the white working class that mean that people of colour are less likely to be in well-paid jobs, don't get hired when they go for interviews, but if they have an ethnic-sounding name, they don't even get a job interview to begin with. It's not the white working class that implements institutionally racist policy, including immigration policy, that meant the Windrush generation was caught up by the hostile environment. That is not the white working class. And so I think that that is one of the narratives to continue to watch out for. Whether that comes up with the European elections, I don't know, but it certainly was reproduced right after Brexit, and that is still something that people believe, and that is the fault of our political and our media class, as well as all of us who haven't challenged it.
Can I just ask Simon to respond to some of the points made by the other speakers? I know that you had some comments.
Yes, thank you. Well, let me just do it in order, because I mainly want to respond to Anne. She won't be surprised about this. I actually began from where Anne is. When I started doing the blog, I was furious with people like Alesina and the minority of economists who thought that austerity was not a problem or indeed good. And, you know, we're together with Paul Krugman and Brad DeLong, you know, we wrote tons of stuff laying into these people. But after a time, I began to realize there will always be. I mean, just think about Brexit. 90 more percent of economists think Brexit is going to be bad. 4% of economists think it's going to be good. Who appears on the television time and again? Patrick Minford. You know, the media selects the economists that it wants. And, you know, it selected the likes of Rogoff and Alesina because they were saying things they already wanted to hear. The idea that these guys were influential and influencing people in a serious way to embark on austerity is nonsense. That's why I try to suggest it comes from an ideology, not from the work of one or two economists. That's not to say that, you know, they can be influential. I wish they weren't there. But they're always going to be there because economics is one of these subjects that attracts people of both left and right ideologies. And, you know, Anne didn't mention the 2 letters in response to the letter she talked about, with many more people signing them. They weren't all heterodox economists. There are many good mainstream economists signing that. Very, very, you know, those letters are produced in a rush, and they easily outnumbered the letter that... and half of the people who wrote that original letter recanted in the New Statesman 2 years later. Sure, but you know, you know, they were used, basically. So, you know, I really wanted to say that. And, of course, I don't blame the media for the global financial crisis. That was a cheap attack. I agree with a lot of things that Maya says. I agree that new Labour appeasement was a serious problem, and I don't mention it enough because I want to emphasise where I see the core, push for these problems coming from. But sure, new Labour appeasement didn't just not help; it actually made it worse. And what's really missing? I mean, I wanted to talk about the improvement in terms of more voters being positive about immigration since people started talking about the problems with people leaving, to illustrate the importance of the absence before that of the narrative saying, we need immigrants, they're good. I didn't really want to suggest that somehow all problems have been solved, because that narrative came out of Brexit, not from politicians. And politicians have not begun to talk, with a few exceptions, have not begun to talk positively about immigration. And finally, Aaron, he's right. I think that there can be a certain amongst some academics, we published on this stuff, why don't the academics pick it up? And they just don't have time. Sorry, why don't the journalists pick it up? And they just don't have time now. They're doing too many other things. And one of the things I've been very critical of bodies like the Royal Economic Society is they don't act as a mouthpiece for economists in situations like Brexit, where clearly the majority, overwhelming majority, thought something. But having agreed with them on that, I've been writing that blog for ages. No mainstream economist, with one exception, has ever even talked to me. And I've written to, I've written actually one blog to a particular well-known, and he's a nice guy, well-known commentator. I won't say who it is, but I wrote a blog saying, please get in contact. I can, because he kept quoting city sources. And I said, please get in contact just to get a different view. And he never has. And just to end on one thing, to reaffirm what Aaron said about sort of natural built-in biases. I remember in the 2015 election, there was a day in which two things happened. There was a letter from, I don't know how many, 100 businessmen, published in the Daily Telegraph, saying how awful Labour was going to be. And there was a survey of UK economists, the majority of whom said austerity had been a bad thing. And for a time, like about 6 hours, they got equal billing. Both mentioned the news. And then people forgot about the economists, but people carried on talking about the letter in the Telegraph. From a self-selected group of businessmen, as opposed to a cross-section survey of economists. That made no sense, except that businessmen are important, economists not so much.
Right, thank you, Simon. We have run out of time, so I think we've had a fantastic debate. I want to leave you with Krugman again. He has written in the preface of Simon's book, and he says that this is a book you should read for understanding what went wrong in the past is our only hope of doing better in the future. And that's the service that Simon is doing. He is highlighting some terrible things which have happened, and hopefully we can avoid doing it again in the future. And simply by having these debates, I sincerely believe that we can't dumb down. We have to tackle these debates head on with the best opinions, with the best analysis, with the best academic response, and fight fire with fire. So I want to thank you all for coming. If you'd like to join us outside, we have, I hope we have some more wine left and some snacks. Simon will be signing his books if you'd like to buy one. Keep an eye on our website. We've got other events coming up. We're going to be at the Labour Party conference. We've got quite a lot of publications and other events in mind. So there's a great deal to do, and we're up for doing it. So thank you very, very much. And I'd like you to join with me in thanking our speakers tonight.